Hello everyone, welcome to another anatomy video, and today we'll be discussing landmarks found in the brain, more specifically landmarks located in the cerebrum and in the diencephalon. I will discuss all the other landmarks found in the CNS in later videos, but for today I'll only be discussing landmarks found in the cerebrum and in the diencephalon. So to start off, let's discuss the landmarks found on the cerebrum. The cerebrum has over 250 landmarks in its entirety, but luckily we only have to learn only a few of them. Upon first glance of the cerebrum, we see a bunch of different folds and grooves on the external surface. The folds located here and all these different little grooves that we see, those are called cerebral sulci. And sulci is plural. If you want to signal to just one particular groove, then that's going to be called a sulcus. So sulci is plural, sulcus is singular. The mounds found above the cerebral sulci, indicated over here and here, all these kind of puffy mounds found on the cerebrum, those are called cerebral gyri. And again, gyri is plural, and for singular it would be gyrus. Having learned the names of the grooves and bumps found on the cerebrum, or more specifically the cerebral gyri and the cerebral sulci, we can go ahead and learn the layers found on the cerebrum. The most external or outward part of the cerebrum is made up of a material called gray matter. And the reason why it appears gray is because it has a high concentration of neuronal bodies. Now, the inmost part of the cerebrum is called white matter. And the reason why it doesn't appear gray is because it's not necessarily as densely packed full of neuronal cell bodies as it is with neuronal tracts, fibrous tracts running through it. And those are the things that you need to know, that the most external or outward part of the cerebrum is made up of gray matter, and as you go deeper into it, it is made up of white matter. Now it's time to learn the different parts of the cerebrum. Right here we can see the anterior view of the cerebrum and the rest of the brain, and the first thing that catches my eye is this large crevice going straight down the center of the cerebrum. This long groove or crevice, whatever you want to call it, has a specific name. The name of that is the longitudinal cerebral fissure. In this fissure, this longitudinal cerebral fissure, divides the cerebrum into two halves, a left and a right half. And we have to actually parent a lot of these landmarks to the corresponding half of the cerebrum. And these halves are called cerebral hemispheres. So for instance, this half right here is going to be the left cerebral hemisphere. And this half is going to be the right cerebral hemisphere. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and learn the lobes found on the cerebrum. In this image, we have the frontal lobe highlighted in green. On this side of the image, we have the frontal lobe of the left cerebral hemisphere. Left cerebral hemisphere. And on this side is just the opposite, is the frontal lobe of the right cerebral hemisphere. Okay? Make sure you parent it to the right and left cerebral hemispheres. Now in this image we have highlighted in green the temporal lobe of the left cerebral hemisphere. And then on the opposite side would be the temporal lobe of the right cerebral hemisphere. In green in this image is going to be the parietal lobe of the left cerebral hemisphere, and it has its corresponding right parietal lobe of, the parietal lobe of the right cerebral hemisphere on the other side. And here in the most posterior aspect of the cerebrum, we see highlighted in green both occipital lobes, both on the left and right cerebral hemisphere. Let me go ahead and write out occipital lobe so you know how to spell it correctly. Okay, and make sure to parent it to the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Here we can see a picture of a lobe that's hidden from the external surface of the cerebrum. You can't see without pulling back parts of the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the parietal lobe. This hidden lobe is called the insular lobe of the left or right cerebral hemisphere. Now you guys have learned all the different lobes found on the cerebrum, but there are still other landmarks that we need to identify on the external surface of the cerebrum. So let's go ahead and learn those. The first external landmark that I want to identify found on the cerebrum is this sulcus located right here between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. This cerebral sulcus has a name. It's called the lateral sulcus of the left or the right cerebral hemisphere. So in this case, this is going to be lateral sulcus of the left cerebral hemisphere. And I'm abbreviating, but when it comes to quizzes and tests, make sure to write out the full name. The next landmark I want to identify is found between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And again, it's another sulcus found right here. And this is going to be called the central sulcus of the left or the right cerebral hemisphere. And the last landmark I want to point out is another sulcus, but it's the division between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. Kind of goes right here. It's not quite easy to see on this image, but this sulcus is called the parieto-occipital sulcus of the left or right cerebral hemisphere. And those are all the different landmarks found on the external surface of the cerebrum. So let's go ahead and go deeper inside the cerebrum. Right here you can see a sagittal cut that was done down the longitudinal cerebral fissure, and it kind of shows different internal landmarks found within the brain. So we're going to go ahead and identify some of those, and I'm going to actually pull up a picture that kind of magnifies the area that I'm going to start explaining. The first landmark I want to identify is this long, bulky looking landmark that I'm highlighting in blue. This landmark right here is called the Corpus Callosum. And the Corpus Callosum can actually be broken down into three separate sections. The most anterior part that forms this thick curvature right here, all this right here, that is called the genu of the Corpus Callosum. Then you have this long, flattened portion kind of in the middle of the Corpus Callosum, and this is going to be the truncus or body of the Corpus Callosum. And lastly, the most posterior part of the Corpus Callosum is called the splenium of the Corpus Callosum. And those are all the different parts found in the Corpus Callosum. Just posterior to the Corpus Callosum is this piece of connective tissue, and it forms as a barrier. And if we remember, barriers are sometimes called septums, like your nasal septum is the barrier between the two sides of your nose, where your nostrils are. Right here, we have another barrier, and it's also a septum, and it actually sounds like a Harry Potter spell. It's called septum pellucidum, and that's how I remember it. I always think of Harry Potter. It's called septum pellucidum. Awesome. Now we can go ahead and move on to the parts of the diencephalon. The diencephalon is located right here in this general area, and it's, as you can see, it's located between the cerebrum and this area down here, which is the mesencephalon. The first landmark that I want to point out within the diencephalon is this area right here. This entire area is called the thalamus. The space within the thalamus is called the third ventricle. So again, this whole area that I circled in blue is the thalamus. The space, the hollow space within the thalamus is called the third ventricle. Now, the thalamus can be broken down into two different parts. You have this upper portion located here, kind of in yellow, and it goes down and back up. This is located above the thalamus, or it's the portion of the thalamus that's most superior. Since it's the most superior part of the thalamus, it is called the epithalamus. The most posterior part of the epithalamus is this small gland right here. This small gland is called the pineal body or the pineal gland. And the pineal gland's really cool because it actually secretes melatonin, which helps you fall asleep. The bottom portion of the thalamus, located down here, is called the hypothalamus. Now the last part of the thalamus that I need to identify is this little notch right here. This notch is called interthalamic adhesion. The interthalamic adhesion is actually pretty interesting because it actually spans from the right thalamus all the way to the other side to the left thalamus and kind of holds the two thalami together and kind of forms this donut hole, which I'll show later, within the third ventricle. And those are all the different landmarks found within the thalamus. So let's go ahead and move on to more landmarks. In this image, I have the eyes included, and the reason why is because I need to show you a structure that leads up to the eye. Right here we have this long nerve. This nerve is called the optic nerve. And the optic nerve meets at a junction located right here. And this junction, it's almost like a crossroads, and I'll go ahead and draw it on the left. So you imagine the structure looking like this. So right here we have the long optic nerves leading up to the eyeballs. Okay? So right here is the optic nerve, and it comes to this junction right here, and that junction is called the optic chiasm. And the optic chiasm then splits into two different parts right here, going to both left and right cerebral hemispheres. These pathways leaving the optic chiasm have a name. They are called optic tracts. So these optic tracts come after the optic chiasm located here at this junction. So it goes from the optic nerve to the optic chiasm and then down the optic tracts. Another structure that you can see just superior to the optic nerves is this long structure right here. That long structure that I'm underlining in green, that's going to be the olfactory tract. And at the end of the olfactory tract is this bulb right here. That is called the olfactory bulb. The next structure I want to point out is actually located just inferior to the optic nerves. And this right here where I'm circling in yellow, that's going to be the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland can be broken down into two parts. There's a posterior lobe of the pituitary gland and a anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now, you can either call them the posterior lobe or the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which is totally correct. Or, if you want to sound cool, you can call the posterior lobe the neurohypophysis. And the anterior lobe is going to be called the adenohypophysis. Hypophysis just means pituitary gland in Latin. So neurohypophysis and adenohypophysis both mean posterior lobe of the pituitary gland and anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Awesome. Now let's go ahead and move on. Right here we have this structure that I'm coloring in blue. This structure has many different parts to it that are important for different reasons. It's all part of the limbic system, which you'll learn in physiology or in psychology. This system is in charge of emotions and memories related to emotions. At the most anterior portion right here, you have this little bulb, anterior and inferior. You have this little bulb right here, and it's actually a gland, and you can actually see the gland on the other side, on the other hemisphere, right here in these two green splotches. These green splotches are actually called mammillary bodies. The part of this structure that's right up against the septum pellucidum, just superior to the epithalamus, this structure is called the fornix of the cerebrum. And the last part of the structure, it may not be required for all anatomy students watching this video, but for those interested, this bottom portion right here is going to be your hippocampus. Cool, now that I've identified all these different landmarks, the last portion of this video I want to dedicate towards the spaces found within the cerebrum and in the diencephalon. I already mentioned a few of these spaces, but I'm going to go ahead and go into more detail and identify where they're located. So in this image, you might not recognize this to be a structure anywhere found in your brain. It might look alien-like, which it kind of does. The reason why this doesn't look familiar is because these are spaces. This is an illustration of the spaces that occupy the thalamus, the diencephalon, and in the cerebrum. So the first thing I want to point out are these large structures here, and they kind of wrap around and go back a little bit. The name of these is called the lateral ventricles. Now, I already talked briefly about this, but the space that occupies where the thalamus is in the diencephalon is called the third ventricle. And finally, located right here is the fourth ventricle. Now, remember how I said that the interthalamic adhesion made like a donut hole inside the donut? Well, this is where the interthalamic adhesion would be. And now you can kind of understand why they sometimes refer to it as how it makes the donut hole right here. So if we numbered them, we could actually number 1, 2, 3, and 4 ventricles. The last thing I need to identify, and this is the last term of this video, is located right here. So right here we have a hole that feeds into the left and right lateral ventricles. This hole, located around where I made this ring, is called the interventricular foramen. Of the cerebrum. And this space right here allows CSF, or cerebral spinal fluid, to flow from the third ventricle all the way up to the lateral ventricles, and vice versa, down the third ventricle, down to the fourth ventricle, and down the spinal cord. So these are all the different spaces located within your brain, and I actually have another image to show you, kind of show the placement of where these spaces are. So here we can see kind of the position of where the lateral ventricle would be. It would be located right here, kind of lateral to the septum pellucidum and the corpus callosum. And then right here you can see this chamber that's fed by the interventricular foramen. And then this space, like I said earlier, is the third ventricle, which is the space that occupies the thalamus. And that is all the landmarks that I have to teach you guys today in this video. Again, we covered the landmarks found in the cerebrum and in the diencephalon. In the next video, I will finish the rest of the landmarks found in the CNS. Hope you guys have a great day and stay safe.